We all have our favorite, our go-to, our guilty pleasure, whatever, something that we can't help but revisit to watch, consume, and or examine again and again because it might have touched us emotionally or intellectually. Maybe it's a favorite book in a book series, a film by a director, a record, or in this instance, maybe a video game which stands out from the hundreds and hundreds of games released, or more specifically, a game in a long-running series. So let me cut to the chase and get to my main argument in this video essay. Breath of the Wild is probably the closest thing to a definitive Legend of Zelda game, and based on its best qualities, may be the best Zelda game in the series. That statement will probably be challenged by other games within the series, but on a design and straight up visceral level, there really is nothing like it on the Nintendo Switch, and so far, there hasn't been any Nintendo exclusive game which rivals it. Now, hold up before any of you in the audience take issue with my opening statement and opinion. Please allow me an opportunity to defend myself. In order for my argument to make any semblance of sense, let us rewind and consider history. If you were a kid playing a Nintendo gaming system for the first time, chances are your very first exposure to a gaming series may have been the Super Mario series. That was the case for me when I was 5 years old, and my very first time playing a Mario game was Super Mario Land. I never got around to finishing the game back then, as any child that age would be distracted by the world they're growing up in. But I imagine for most of you, your first exposure to video games felt magical, like something your imagination couldn't fully comprehend was right there at your fingertips. And the best part about this feeling is that it's timeless and not based on any given year or decade. So if you were a kid growing up in the early 90s, your first game was probably Super Mario World or Super Mario 3 on the Super Nintendo system. If it was the mid-90s, Super Mario 64 was your first Mario game on the Nintendo 64 system, maybe even the first ever played. Likewise with Nintendo's other massive franchise, the Legend of Zelda series. If you were an early 90s kid, A Link to the Past was your first Zelda game. Mid-90s, Ocarina of Time or Majora's Mask on the Nintendo 64. The 2000s, Wind Waker, and so on. And more so than Mario, the world of Zelda was full of fantasy and magic right at your fingertips. Growing up as gamers gives us plenty of experience to know ourselves better and our ability to choose which genres of gaming work best for us and which games feel just as great in our youth as they are now. And most of us are also familiar with choosing which titles are nearly perfect, timeless classics and which ones haven't held up well to scrutiny years later. On a critical and fan level, when I'm talking about the Legend of Zelda series, while I will never claim to be an armchair Zelda expert, despite the obvious pretentious name of this YouTube channel, I can safely say that selections from the series like Ocarina of Time and A Link to the Past are nearly untouchable classics even with the technological limits and shortcomings of their time. And while a Zelda game like Wind Waker was not as well received as the aforementioned two, mostly because of its divisive art direction which looks like it was catering towards children, I mean video games aren't just pieces of art after all, they are toys. Wind Waker has since been regarded as a top 5 Zelda game for most gamers. On the other hand, gamers and critics can point to titles like Triforce Heroes and Zelda 2 The Adventures of Link as not completely bad but somewhere at the bottom of top Zelda games lists. And also, and forgive me for pointing towards non-Nintendo system games, but Faces of Evil and Wand of Gamelon are so epically bad that Nintendo hasn't even bothered giving them remastered versions. Regardless of these shortcomings, which are really just unnoticeable dents to a gaming legacy like Zelda, when you take a step back from your Nintendo consoles and think about it, every game in the Zelda series is following the next step in a gradual evolution of not just Zelda games, but in the overall evolution of technology to create and design video games. games, more so than Nintendo's other big series, Super Mario. The history of video gaming from the 80s onward is essentially a story of progress in a medium which, while there are obvious titles void of any meaningful analysis mechanically or storytelling wise, other video games have stood the test of time, so much so that they have allowed themselves to be seen through the lenses of critics in the same way someone might explain to you all the possible meanings complex and dense pieces of literature like Gravity's Rainbow or Ulysses might be within. To use just one example of a video game genre showing technological evolution, shooting games evolving from Wolfenstein, Doom, System Shock, Quake, Half-Life, System Shock 2, Half-Life 2, BioShock, and onward, to name a few, shows that these games have their positive qualities due to them being innovative for their time. These aren't just shooters, they're saying something. A game like System Shock 2 is saying something about individuality. BioShock built on System Shock 2 by taking the medium of utopian literature and creating a what can go wrong with a secret underwater objectivist society, along with the fantastic immersive gameplay. And while Doom might have been demonized, no pun intended, in the 90s, along with Mortal Kombat, for making that generation's children out to be saying this, Doom might just be the greatest Christian game ever released in gaming history, despite being programmed by an atheist. Regardless of how empty some critically acclaimed games might be on a surface level, these games are saying something about society and how we tell stories. We have moved past the late great film critic Roger Ebert's declaration that video games are not art from 2005, and nearly 2 decades later, video games, even popular AAA games, are subject as a form of art to criticism from gaming media publications and the gaming audience. And each new game release means an opportunity to take advantage of the technological advances in gaming while attempting new ways to tell familiar stories or try to come up with something unique, especially in the avenue of indie gaming. And for Nintendo gaming, this is more true for the Zelda series than Super Mario, Star Fox, Kirby, or Metroid games. Someone close in my life said this word for word, and sometimes when I'm thinking about how Zelda games fit into how I play and examine games, kids might play Mario, but everybody plays Zelda. When we're talking about Nintendo specifically, there's a big difference between having your friends over for pizza and binging through 40 plus levels of Mario Kart 8 versus having some time to kill and having the need to relax. So popping in Breath of the Wild on your screen might give you a breather. That is, unless you're stuck trying to find a shrine or you can't find a way to beat a Lynel or a Hinox with a stick branch while half naked. Full disclosure, my first exposure to a Legend of Zelda game was A Link to the Past on the SNES. Alongside briefly playing a bit of Link's Awakening on Game Boy, despite that game not taking place in Hyrule or even having Zelda as a character. You know, the title character of the series. I never really got around to finishing playing them in my childhood. Most of my early childhood gaming time was done playing various EA Sports games like NHL 94, Madden 97, or obscure PC games like Michael Jordan Flight. Yeah, if we're talking about games in a general sense, as someone who's played competitive varsity sports in high school like lacrosse and football and recreational roller hockey and basketball, if I had to choose between playing video games or competitive sports games, I would have to choose the latter category. There's just something about being part of a team and working together to win a championship that feels more satisfying because you know in these team situations, it can't take one person to win, say, a Stanley Cup, a World Series, an NBA championship, or a Super Bowl. Of course, that team situation doesn't play out in video games where all you have is a controller and, unlike in a real team situation, in the virtual world, you're essentially playing God controlling a sports franchise, and all those virtual championships are just that. Virtual, but I would equate that feeling of satisfaction with winning a real-life sports game or championship with a team to the individual gaming experience of, let's say, beating Bowser and watching him fall into lava in Mario, defeating Andross in Star Fox, or even collecting all 158 Pokemon in the first Pokemon games. As I got older, while I was familiar with the Zelda series, it was never really my go-to series due to the gap spending free time gaming because of work and other real-life circumstances. However, over 20 years later after my first Zelda experience, I revisited the Zelda series during April and May of, yep, 2020 during the start of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, and when, despite the days getting longer and the weather getting warmer, there was an awful lot of uncertainty as to what would happen next in the real world. And even today, as the pandemic affects the labor force through long COVID, along with allowing climate change to wreak havoc on the planet for years to come, video games, along with books, music, and painting watercolor and acrylic pictures, are a nice, useful, and most of the time healthy retreat for me. Unless, of course, I am stuck on a boss fight. And I am sure for some of you in the audience, video games can be useful if you need a safe haven when there's a lot going on in the real world. So I may not have the exact same Super Nintendo I had when I was a kid, but thankfully I bought myself an SNES Classic Edition a few years back, and one of the games pre-installed in the system was A Link to the Past. Seeing as how most of my free time was doing other extracurricular activities like making music and reading a ton of books, I would spend my mornings in quarantine exploring the world of Hyrule, interacting with the people and going back and forth between the light and dark worlds, and dealing with the various monsters and enemies. Because of letting my natural curiosity get in the way of completing the game all in one day, I spent an hour or two each morning for 2 weeks going through Hyrule when I wasn't completing missions and gathering necessary hearts and items for the final Ganon battle. Granted, probably the average runtime to beat A Link to the Past takes probably 3 to 4 hours for most gamers, but for me, I didn't mind my run being a little longer because I was interested in how the development team created such a fascinating world for its time. And when it was finally all over and I let the Master Sword sleep again, I had that exact same feeling of satisfaction from completing not just other games, but making real-world accomplishments in life. If I could beat this game, I could do anything. Which leads me to talk about the game in question. Breath of the Wild, or BOTW for short, was released on the 3rd of March in 2017, and in terms of the timeline in the Zelda universe, while there was a debate as to how each game is ordered despite the branching off, it's confirmed that Breath of the Wild sits right at the end of the order of events. However, you don't need to be an armchair Zelda historian to know who the 7 sages were, or for that matter, who was Navi and Ocarina, and how exactly the Master Sword was created in Skyward Sword, as BOTW tells an entirely new story heavily reliant on a non-linear path which allows gamers to choose how they tell Link's story. Today, Breath of the Wild is the top-selling game in history, having sold over 30 million copies as of the writing of this script, and is regarded as one of the greatest games of all time, which is not really a surprise for longtime Nintendo players. With each generational console, it always seems like a Zelda game is regarded as one of the greatest games. And as already discussed, the Zelda games have always followed through with tweaking the game mechanics, improving game design, and making the art direction and sound design feel like you're actually on a fantasy journey. And Breath of the Wild, even with its own minor complaints and nitpicks, is just following through on the journey of game development progress, but with a massive exclamation point. I revisited Breath of the Wild in March of 2021 and finished the game somewhere around the end of June, when I usually stop playing video games because, well, by then summertime had arrived and I don't like spending too much time gaming indoors when the weather is getting nicer. That's at least how I feel, and going off the grid from gaming for a few months helps freshen my mind and loosens up my hands a bit from getting too tense after holding the controller for too long. And taking it easy on the stress and fun that can come from gaming for a few months allows me to contemplate about what I got from the games I played for the last 8 to 9 months, and what titles I'm looking forward to trying out. In other words, it's okay to take a break sometimes. Nevertheless, even while on summer gaming sabbatical, it's hard not to feel tempted to revisit games, which will stick to my mind and make me think all of the ways I could have gone about solving that scenario to completing a mission quest, or maybe how I would have handled a particular boss one way or another. Great games are like great books, films, or music records. You can't help but talk about them, and dive in all the ways in which these pieces of media work. I would argue Breath of the Wild is the best or second best game in the Zelda series, not simply because of the critical reviews according to Metacritic or how it's the latest one until the sequel, Tears of the Kingdom, which will arrive soon this May, Hell, I can go on all day and night and explain how its open world version of Hyrule allows gamers to tell their own version of Link's story, and pick how they'll finish each main or side quest, how one can sit back and relax to the piano soundtrack while venturing out in the day, seeking out and exploring any shrine, mineral, food, Korok seed, or whatnot, go on combat adventures with the various enemies, hunt wild animals to cook, encounter mythical dragons who will shoot out ice, electric, or fire attacks, and on, which is what I am going to try and do in a more condensed way in this essay, but my gut tells me, based on my previous experience, that this game is the closest thing, at times, to feeling like more than just the traditional Zelda game where you know there's a good and evil story going on, which needs to be resolved sooner or later. The experience just feels real, as I'm simulating hiking and venturing out for hours on end, or even riding on horseback, or the Master Cycle if that's your ride. And the only thing that stops me from spending all of my days stuck on the couch playing is my urge to walk out the front door and check out, well, nature outside. But is it the greatest Zelda game? I am not asking this question for myself. In fact, it's more or less directed towards you, the gaming audience familiar with this game and every other game in the Zelda series presumably. Every gamer's experience is subjective and based on your own upbringing, so certain titles will have a more personal effect as opposed to a 100% objective opinion. It's impossible to be entirely objective, and if it were that way, reviewing and revisiting games would be dull, because ultimately the personal does matter. Your childhood games may not feel the same way as they do now with more experience, but they still affect how you can feel and express yourself. So, does this really hold up as well as it did when it was first released in 2017? Is Breath of the Wild the very best of the Legend of Zelda series? He meant to say yes. Anyway, let me explain my stance by pointing to the world building first. And just a forewarning, like with all of my video game video essays and retrospectives, this will contain spoilers for Breath of the Wild, as well as several previous Zelda games, so this essay will assume you have played at least one Zelda game. Otherwise, if you haven't already, you definitely need to play Breath of the Wild, because positive qualities aside, it's a hell of a fun time. As discussed before, the world of Hyrule in previous Zelda games is, shall we say, limited in scope, though that does not make the gaming experience of revisiting A Link to the Past terrible, just that there is no way to put the numerous locations from Breath of the Wild in Hyrule like Gerudo or Hebron the same way in older games, what with the limited design and programming ability with older Nintendo consoles. In earlier Zelda titles, with most of them following linear gameplay and storytelling, everything felt like walking distance, with a few examples like A Link to the Past where you could just call upon Flute Boy's bird to get you around, along with the numerous ways to warp around. Nevertheless, every Zelda game has built up the world building of Hyrule and expanded upon it to accommodate all of the intrigue and innovative methods for Link to complete his journey, with a few additions. Of course, the upcoming Tears of the Kingdom will expand upon its predecessor with floating cities, but for now, in Breath of the Wild, while there isn't any time travel involved or detours between two separate light and dark worlds, the world of Hyrule has a lot of variety going for it, as opposed to other past games. In A Link to the Past, you couldn't climb down mountains. Now in Breath of the Wild, all you need is enough stamina circles and maybe the climbing gear, along with a stamina elixir, to help you take on the biggest hills. In that same previous game, a place like Turtle Rock Dungeon was a challenging platforming puzzle to navigate around, even in 2D animation. Now Breath of the Wild gives you 120 plus puzzles to solve through the ancient shrine quests and shrine puzzles to solve. You just have to be sure to familiarize yourself with the numerous runes you're given at the beginning area of Hyrule called the Great Plateau. So this essay is not intended to summarize all of the story details in the game, assuming you're a casual gamer and you've had at least one run with Breath of the Wild. But just to cap off the opening sequence, you wake up inside the Shrine of Resurrection, hearing the voice of Zelda calling upon you. You arise and walk out to the piano playing the theme music, cueing the title card, before you encounter the old man who carries with him the paraglider you'll need to shortcut your travel in the air, and also because it looks cooler than simply walking walking around Hyrule. Right out of the gate, the Great Plateau gives you a taste of what's out there. You gather some apples and nuts and swords around you. You get to practice some of your acquired runes through the device you carry called the Sheikah Slate, remote bombs, magnesis, status, and cryonis. Some of these you will have to utilize one way or another when you're completing the shrine puzzles in order to achieve spirit orbs, which you use to pray to one of the statues all around Hyrule so you can get either more hearts or stamina. You'll also realize that the enemies of Hyrule don't sleep, as unless you choose to sleep by fire until morning, you'll have to fight off all the skeleton baddies. It's a nice introduction to the open world gameplay, but there's just one problem. Your open world is closed off until you find all 3 of the shrines within the Great Plateau, and have your last interaction with the old man who follows you around, revealing himself to be none other than the late King Roham. Oh, I won't even bother pronouncing that. There's a lot there in story and gameplay that Breath of the Wild brings to the table, even if you're figuring out how to navigate for the first time in the Great Plateau. But one thing that gives the gaming experience of Breath of the Wild an advantage over other games in the series is that, apart from the enemies who respawn with every blood moon rising again, there is an enemy you may not take into consideration while playing: the environment. Most of Hyrule is relatively open for you to explore safely, barring you can deal with many bokoblins, lizaflos, and moblins lurking around, to name a few. But the environment of Breath of the Wild's Hyrule can either be your best friend on a sunny day, or an annoying and fatal foe. For example, when lightning is in the forecast, you have to put away any metallic gear and weapons you have on you, as metal conducts electricity, and maybe you could make use of the rubber armor if you find all of the parts. Likewise, unless you know how to make a chilly elixir, you will get a taste of how cold weather can bite a little of your health when you're exploring certain parts around the Great Plateau area to start off your journey. And if you need a tire that can protect you from the cold, picking up a snow quill set in Retold Village will help you navigate the Heber Mountains and Gerudo Highlands, to name a few cold places. There's tons of armor lying around in Hyrule and in the shrines, and more if you get the DLC, as well as a few amiibo figures to scan, and you'll have an opportunity to upgrade your gear if you stop by a fairy fountain. And going back to climbing from earlier, stamina also plays a part when you're playing Breath of the Wild. You can't just start climbing the highest of mountains when you're starting out exploring the world, as you only start out with a small amount of stamina to begin with. Likewise, stamina is needed for when you're swimming and need to get to the coast, or on top of a hill to climb. Otherwise, if you don't have enough stamina, you'll drown and lose a heart. It also plays a big part in how you acquire the many horses around Hyrule roaming in the wild, but more on that in the next chapter. Other than all those gameplay aspects and then some I haven't mentioned yet, the environment of Hyrule is the closest thing to a world which feels alive. Obviously, it's only a game and not real life, but everything about walking on the grass, from the look of it, the sound design when you're walking through it or even cutting it with a sword, is pretty close to replicating actually walking on grass and feeling it for yourself. The sound effects from swimming, and for that matter, checking a view of the water and seeing the reflection of the moon or blood moon when it's about to come, are also nice little touches that could have been done in a half-assed effort by a team of programmers, but the team behind Breath of the Wild went above and beyond to polish the small details in each area of Hyrule and make the environment look lively. One more aspect to the world of Hyrule in Breath of the Wild that makes it a fine time to play anytime are the soundtrack cues telling you where you are, and how the soundtrack is fantastic and a very meditative, relaxing experience to listen to. Even if some of the songs are reworked versions of songs from previous Zelda games, you know when it's the daytime when the piano is calming, or when nighttime arrives and the piano takes a sinister, creepy turn before the skeleton monsters come out from the ground. You'll know you're in Zora's domain when you hear its theme music sounding like an upgrade from the one in Ocarina of Time, almost like you're in an oceanfront resort. Retold Village sounds blissful as you're taking in the heights and the sky with the bird-like Rito people. Gerudo Town's theme is appropriate for its desert environment, and Gorgon City sounds goofy. Of course, you'll hear some obvious cues like the overworld theme on the piano, or the fairy fountain theme every time you need to upgrade your outfits. The music just adds another element to the environment of Hyrule that sets itself apart from other Zelda games. Of course, if you're going to play a Zelda game, you're going to be investing time in saving Hyrule too. So let us discuss further the many faces, departed heroes, and enemies you'll encounter. Yet another reason why this game sets itself apart is that the people make the rest of the game's environment feel welcoming. Well, not always if you're, Vo and trying to get yourself into Gerudo Town without the proper outfit, or if you make the mistake of stepping on some flowers. Not only that, but in this version of Hyrule, apart from the Gerudo tradition of not allowing Hylian men into town, it's pretty proud of the many races and cultures that exist, and it's also a compliment to the production team that they took the time to think about the dialogue and little details regarding some of the minor characters and passerbys who walk or settle around the many areas in the game, from characters pivotal to explaining some of the background story, like say, Prince Sidon, for example, his Hollywood smile, and his direct family relation with the late Mipha, reoccurring faces like Beetle, a veteran side character in Zelda games who sells you items at the stables and has a thing for, well, beetles, specifically energetic rhino beetles, and even seemingly minor characters like Brigo at Proxim Bridge, who has a grim outlook at what's to come and yet stops you from jumping off the bridge, showing that despite his negative outlook at the events to come, he still cares about your well-being. There's a ton more characters I haven't touched on, but I think you got the point. The people around this world can be described in one word: diverse. We'll come back to the champions for a moment as they make this point more clearly, but in Breath of the Wild, each race of people was affected by the birth of the calamity one way or another, and 4 of the areas were more directly impacted due to the loss of their respective champion. You'll interact with people in each town and village, but you'll also come across people walking along the trails, some of them in danger from a group of bokoblin on horseback, which you'll have to put down. Most people are friendly enough to take the time and may even give you a gift or a shrine or side quest to complete, though do be cautious. Talk to the wrong Hylian and you might reveal a member of the Yiga clan, a rogue Sheikah clan swearing loyalty to Ganon, and mostly a nuisance. Annoying when they pop up, but an annoying nuisance nonetheless. So, in past Zelda games, the games were based on previous fantasy and medieval elements to make entertaining gaming stories, but here in Breath of the Wild, the Hylians have, or at least had something to make use of, and to hopefully develop further into the future: technology. Games like A Link to the Past and Ocarina of Time dealt with wizards and fairies, but here their inventions were evolving, allowing them to create the Guardians as well as assigning one champion to take control of 4 of the giant behemoth mechanical monsters, the Divine Beasts, before Ganon would arise and affect them with the calamity to use to his advantage. After the first great calamity, 10,000 years before the events of the game, the world feared that the technology would backfire on them again should Ganon rise, and the Sheikah, the race most responsible for developing the technology, split into 2 groups: the Sheikah who have settled within Hyrule, and the Yiga clan, spying on people in Kakariko village, as well as terrorizing Gerudo. There's examples of the evolving technology around Hyrule, such as the Hateno and Akala ancient tech labs, both which need the always burning blue flame to power, and the latter lab is where you can get upgrades and weapons utilizing Guardian technology. However, the most obvious example of technology is right there on Link's belt, the Sheikah Slate. Not only does it contain the runes needed to get around Hyrule and find secrets, but it also comes with a camera you acquire at the Hateno lab, so you can complete the Hyrule Compendium and photograph all the various animals, monsters, weapons, and items to learn more about them and where they're located. Of course, there's the obvious meta imagery of the slate resembling a certain gaming console when handheld, and its ability to take screenshots being a little on the nose. Besides being able to warp shrine to shrine or hike all the way around Hyrule by foot, you can also familiarize yourself with the horses found near certain stables and register up to 5. Not only can certain horses go up to 5 star points for stamina, but you'll also learn that horses aren't the only animals you can ride on back. Animals such as certain deer and even bears can be tamed, just enough that you can ride on them for a while, though you can't register them in a stable. For example, I absolutely love checking out black bears during my real life hikes, and I always try to be respectful to them by keeping a distance and saying hello to alert them that I'm there. So seeing the Honeywore and Grizzle Maw bears and taming them before they have the chance to attack me in Breath of the Wild is one of the fun little things I enjoy about this game. But they won't stick around for long, as they'll run off like a few bears I found at Gerudo Highlands. Also, you'll learn that you can't just climb on top a 5-star horse with one circle bar of stamina unless you have enough stamina elixirs, as it will just knock you over and it might hurt you in the process. As you advance, there will be some secret horses you can find, like the giant horse, which looks like one Ganondorf would ride, and the great white stallion, Princess Zelda's personal horse. However, when it comes to secret steeds, the Lord of the Mountain in Satori Mountain is a must-ride for me, and it may be a little too advanced for novice gamers. Not only do you need enough stamina, but you have to be discreet and swift about it, especially if you happen to have a Sheikah outfit on. Otherwise, you might scare it off, and the only downside to riding one is that no stable will register the Lord since it's a cursed monster, and if you leave it alone for a little bit, it'll ride off and vanish. However, after playing Breath of the Wild for so long, I find that my go-to ride isn't a horse or bear, but the rune you can get on when you complete the Champion's Ballad DLC quest, the Master Cycle 0. Technically, the Master Cycle 0 is the 5th Divine Beast, one which you can activate with the Sheikah Slate. It also requires items to be filled into it in exchange for fuel, which can be dealt with by putting in some spare fruit like apples. You won't be able to ride the cycle in certain areas of the game, and the cycle disappears if you fall off a mountain. Somewhere in me, I care a little too much about a horse's well-being and don't want to overwork them, and unlike the cycle, horses can actually die while in combat, unless you resurrect them with the help of a payment of 1,000 rupees to the horse god Malanya near the horse god bridge. And as a special bonus for Nintendo gamers, for anyone familiar with Mario Kart 8, you know that you can let Link ride the Master Cycle 0 while having fun with your friends. But moving on to enemy combat. I long for combat. The roster of monsters in Breath of the Wild is a solid all-star cast of baddies upgraded and redesigned from previous Zelda games, who will vary in armor and type depending on the area you're at, and some common enemies like the Lizaflos, the dancing Wizrobes, and the Choo-Choo can also have adaptations based on the environment of a given area, like fire in Goron or ice in the Hebra Mountains. The various Bokoblins, Moblins, and Lizaflos will usually come in red, blue, black, and silver skins, and even yellow in Master Mode if you want a challenge. The Choo-Choo are kind of a joke, the Octorok are the worst and most annoying of the bunch, and the Wizrobes are mostly a nuisance. And once you kill these enemies and get their body parts, you can use them to create elixirs, or you can sell them to the Humpty Dumpty looking monster fanatic Kilton for Mon. Because, you know, it's short for monster and also money. Now, maybe you're impatient with having to fight baddies, wait for the next blood moon for them to regenerate and repeat, and are looking for a challenge. One option is to find the 3 dragons, Dinra, Baruch, and Nadra, learn their paths and try to shoot arrows to acquire a piece of their horn, fang, scale, or claw, and then either sell them or use them to upgrade gear like the Champion's Tunic or the Armor of the Wild. The Hinox are comically easy to beat for such huge monsters, even their more advanced types. My strategy is to use Revali's gear, shoot arrows in slow motion to get his eye, then use Urbosa's Fury to weaken him, and then attack him in any fashion. I always look forward to taking on the Lynels. They're the toughest of the bunch besides the 4 Ganon forms, and if you're feeling greedy and want a bigger challenge, you can fight a Golden Lynel in Master Mode. So overall, combat can be fun, and sometimes you get awarded some items from the skull-looking treasure chests. Just don't get too comfortable. Your worst enemy encounter in Breath of the Wild won't be Beetle trying to take away your energy beetle, or anyone trying to attack you. It's the falcon-looking green Rito Cass and his fucking accordion. God forbid someone tells him to shut the hell up and just point me to a shrine to unlock. Like, Oh my god, he looks more muscular than Revali, and yet he's too fucking lazy to even take flight and fight. Anyway, regardless of how you go about your journey, patience is a reward for gamers, and Breath of the Wild rewards you once you completed plenty of strides and are able to get more hearts and stamina to deal with combat and exploring tougher areas which require enough stamina to climb mountains and or Revali's Gale once you require it to get a little higher, so you don't waste your stamina points. To put it another way, Hyrule as a virtual open world environment compared to say Hollow Nest in the 2D animated game Hollow Knight, where that game's environment can be incredibly painful, frustrating, and unforgiving for newbies, and even some veterans of the game will slip up sometimes, and new gamers will have to learn to appreciate failure and defeat when exploring areas like Crystal Peak or Fungal Waste for the first time. And this can take forever, but more on that game for another video. The point is that unlike Hollow Knight, Breath of the Wild is pretty forgiving. Moving on from there. It's dangerous to go alone. That quote from the old man in the original NES Legend of Zelda game has been defining for a series as legendary as Legend of Zelda. It's a meme, a memorable quote, or an irony, because ultimately, with the exception of engaging with Hylian townfolk and other races, most of these adventures involve Link venturing out on his own, albeit with some assistance here and there from Zelda. And most of your travel in Breath of the Wild is a solitary one, albeit one which can be calming. Breath of the Wild's backstory provides one possible scenario where Link and Zelda would not be fighting Ganon alone, as 4 of the areas in Hyrule are represented by champions, the sweet and nurturing Mipha of Zora's domain, who was thought to be in love with Link at least according to one of, this bird's songs, the bulky and goofy Gorgon warrior Daruk of Goron, who's afraid of dogs, the lightning dancing Urbosa of Gerudo, and Revali of Retold Village, who, along with Zelda, is initially skeptical and resistant to Link being Zelda's personal guard, but as a ghost he respects you after you have freed Vamido. Based upon viewing the flashbacks as well as the ones in the Champions Ballot you find in some areas in Hyrule, there was the possibility we would be seeing these 4 characters fight alongside Link and Zelda. But that scenario was thrown out the window after Ganon took control of the castle. The 4 mammoth-sized divine beasts meant to do damage to Ganon should he come back, and the Guardians meant to protect the kingdom, and as a result, 4 champions died trying to protect the world and its people. Nevertheless, if you choose to free the divine beasts in certain shrine quests require you to free them first, you can also acquire 4 powers from each of the characters. Mipha's Grace, which restores your life and gives you extra yellow hearts should you lose your hearts. Revali's Gale, which launches you into the air and helps you paraglide and get to higher heights on mountains and buildings. Urbosa's Fury, which sends powerful lightning strikes down should you do a charged attack. And Daruk's Protection, which provides a rocky shield protection besides your actual shield and deflects attacks, even from Guardians. It's worth reminding from the last chapter that this team of champions, along with the various races across Breath of the Wild's version of Hyrule, represents a pretty diverse and, shall we say, all-star collection of various species and races from previous Zelda games. The Gorons go as far back as Ocarina of Time, as do the people of Zora's domain. The Rito go back to the Wind Waker, albeit they're more bird-like here, and the Gerudo still have the same characteristics from previous games. On a related side note, the diversity in the world of Hyrule in the game all comes together in one of the optional side quests where you lend a helping hand in the creation of the small island town Terry Town in the middle of Lake Akala. While we are on the subject of the champions, I think it's a pretty good time to discuss the 4 areas where you learn each of their backstories and how they know you prior to the events of the game. All 4 champions are new characters from previous races introduced in the game, along with some of the side characters like Prince Sidon and Unobo, and the champions also appear in the side game Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity, and each of these champions represent one of the 4 divine beasts. Valruta and Zora, Varudamana on Death Mountain, Vamido around Retold Village, and Naboris in the Gerudo Desert, all 4 needing to be freed from the control of Ganon before acquiring the champion's powers. On the one hand, the people of Retold Village, Zora's domain, and Goron City are pretty welcoming of you, save for the elderly Zora Muzu's initial distrust and belief that Hylians were responsible for Mipha's death and the calamity, as well as the late Revali's reluctance to accept you as Zelda Zelda's personal guard. On the other hand, Gerudo Town still has restrictions for Vo, even as Chief Riju knows who you really are and after you've freed Valnaboris. Most, if not all, of the people are pretty accepting of you because you're carrying the Sheikah Slate. You'll want to stick around the 4 areas where each divine beast is nearby, as engaging with some of the NPC townfolk will lead to some shrine quests and side quests. And for convenience sake, there is always a shrine in each of these areas for you to teleport to, making travel easy, unless, you want to travel all day by horse. Of course, if you're feeling like you need a bit more of a challenge, the Champions Ballad allows you to boost up your champion powers by shortening the time it takes to recharge your powers. But although you can use some runes, say for the Master Cycle 0 during shrine puzzles, you can't use these champion powers if you're either in a shrine or if you're doing the Master Sword trials. Which reminds me, as far as strategizing how you will deal with combat, with the exception of the Bow of Light and the Master Sword, which needs to be re-energized after breaking for 10 minutes, every weapon, bow, and shield you pick up is subject to breakage, so this forces you to think about which weapon you'll use in combat, which blade or axe you use to chop down trees for wood to make fires or to mine minerals, or which bows you'll use for either hunting or for popping balloons to get Korok seeds. Also, you can't carry all the weapons you come across as your inventory is capped even after you trade Korok seeds for inventory slots. All of this can become frustrating as you will be rewarded rare items once you free the divine beast, and you'll also have to decide which items in your inventory you have to drop or keep, but that could also be a benefit if you want to have weapons with high attack points. You can't repair these items if they break or restore them like your dead horses, so you're better off holding on to that silver longsword or ceremonial trident to name a few weapons, or you can store some items in the house you buy in Hadendo village and frame them just in case, but you're better off hanging rare items on the wall which you don't want to break. So I like to think I spent plenty of time going over basic plot points and navigating around the world of Hyrule in Breath of the Wild, and I'm pretty sure I haven't even covered every single point that's available to make about this game. So the remaining chapters of this essay will deal with themes, narrative storytelling, and the game's deeper meaning, and how gamers should view Link as a hero. This is but one of the legends of which the people speak. Opening text, The Legend of Zelda, The Wind Waker. So I'm sure you're all aware of the old saying, simple is better. In Nintendo gaming, you're used to saving Princess Peach in Super Mario, saving the Lylat system from Andross and Star Fox, and even in Sega games, you know you have to stop Dr. Robotnik in Sonic. Not too complicated, simple for adults, and just right for kids to get into gaming. And just as with those aforementioned games, Breath of the Wild doesn't need an overcomplicated story for it to work, as again, it's a simple reiteration of a classic gaming story, albeit one which the creators are mindful of the back catalog of Zelda games. It's a simple yet tried and true, and then some accolades formula. A hero who has been asleep for years reawakens to find his homeland Hyrule and its kingdom in danger from a malevolent force named Ganon, or Ganondorf in some games, a Triforce which connects the 3 main characters, which Ganon either seeks or already has, and if left for Ganon to hold, threatens the entire world and its people, and a princess named Zelda, who needs to be saved and needs you to restore the power of the Triforce. Differences between individual games aside, we all know the hero's journey in these games, and if you compare your Breath of the Wild Link journey to this illustration of the hero's journey in literature, even with the monomyth being subject to intense academic criticism, you can see that he fits pretty well within certain stages. There's a call to adventure for amnesia-inflicted Link to save Hyrule and the princess who's trapped within the calamity-infested castle. He gets supernatural aid through Zelda speaking to his thoughts, along with the presence of the 4 champion ghosts and their individual powers. He's challenged through combating the enemies, unlocking the shrine puzzles, reclaiming the Master Sword, and restoring the Divine Beast, among other tasks he must fulfill. Hell, you could argue that the hero's journey began before you wake up in the Shrine of Resurrection, 100 years before you passed out, and as the game began, you were only just waking up at the Abyss and Death and Rebirth part, besides all of the times you're killed off playing the game. Again, it's a simple video game story, one which has been successful, not just on a critical and commercial level. But here, and as said before, there's one particular element to this game that separates it from all of its predecessors. Breath of the Wild's non-linear storytelling based on the individual gamer's input. The game begins with you in the Shrine of Resurrection. The game ends after you beat Ganon, and you're pretty much free to do whatever you think is necessary to prepare yourself for the final battle in between. This has a lot of advantages, as you get to invest a lot of time venturing out, but it's easy to be tempted to rush the whole damn thing. During my first playthrough of Breath of the Wild, I chose to look for all of the 120 shrines around Hyrule, freeing all 4 of the divine beasts in the process before talking with Mipha and checking out the 12 locations around Hyrule to learn more about the backstory. It's just one way to tell the story of Breath of the Wild. But looking back now, that first time playing it was essentially a shortcut as to finding out more about the individual champions and how they felt about Link, Zelda's desires and what she wants, as well as the relationship between her and her overbearing and overprotective king father. Without doing the immediate path of going right to Ganon after completing the Great Plateau requirements, I was more interested in getting right into finding all the shrines and beasts and becoming more powerful before the final Ganon battle. In other words, I was cheating myself and not taking in all of the game's best qualities. The second time around, when I started a new round of Breath of the Wild, after getting the paraglider and runes, I immediately went to Kakariko Village to see Mipha, and I took note of each of the locations to get their respective cutscene, taking note of their location on the map and exploring around in case I missed any chest or Korok seed. Not that I was interested in getting all 900. Not only that, but I ended up completing the additional shrines through the DLC, as well as taking in the environment, venturing out hunting, riding a horse or cycling, learning each useful meal, interacting with the NPCs, finding gems to sell, riding the Lord of Mountain a few times, and having more fun fighting each Hinox and Lynel. As a result, my second time around playing the game was much more fulfilling, even if the hours spending playing were longer. And even after being Ganon and my game saved at Hyrule Castle, I still ventured out and did any side quests I might have missed, along with all of the tasks I mentioned because I was just so interested in this world. My second Breath of the Wild playthrough story is linked to me wanting Link to keep going and never taking a break until I explore the whole world. Speaking of which, just think about the name of the game's main character, Link. That's a pretty bizarre name, not just because he's not the title character of the series, the Princess Zelda is. For a story based in a fantasy setting, the name Link sounds too modern. However, most of you would agree that the name is pretty appropriate. The creator of the Zelda series, Shigeru Miyamoto, was influenced to create the character Link based on his childhood memories of fantasy entertainment and media, including the Lord of the Rings books. And as he aptly puts it, Link is literally a link between two worlds, the virtual world and our real world, as this quote explains. Quote, Link is a regular boy when the game begins, but destiny makes him fight evil. I think many people dream about becoming heroes. For me, it has always been important that the gamers grow together with Link, that there is a strong relationship between the one who holds the controller and the person who is on the screen. I tried to create the feeling that you really are in Hyrule, end of quote. And that link between the character of Link in the game and you as the gamer is even more highlighted when you consider that, in Breath of the Wild, Link is presented not as some nagging teenage boy or even some buffed up kid who looks too ripped for his champion's garment. No, all that is because here, Link is gender neutral. Breath of the Wild acknowledges that gamers are a diverse community, and Link, while still being presumably a teen at 17 before being frozen in time for 100 years before the game's events, is even more relatable. Everybody wants to be a hero in some way. Everybody wants their lives to be bigger than they are. For kids in the 80s and 90s, Hyrule may have been a whole magical world at your fingertips, whether or not you were holding an NES controller or Game Boy, but today it feels so small despite each game's respective legacy. However, Breath of the Wild makes Hyrule not only bigger, but the intended purpose of Link as a protagonist much bigger. Without the straightforward linearity of past games, Breath of the Wild is the closest thing to your own Link story. Another thing to keep in mind is that this version of Princess Zelda was named by King Roham based on royal tradition, so we can assume that the world is aware of the many tales of Link and Zelda told over the last thousands of years, and the royal family is carrying on that tradition by remembering remembering the tales from previous games. So Link and Zelda may not be the exact same characters from previous games, unless you subscribe to the idea that Link is a sleeping hero who awakens at the right time when Hyrule is under attack. But maybe the past versions of Link and Zelda are ancestors. One more deviation from previous Zelda games is how the makers frame this version of Ganon. Ganon is no longer the balding, orange-haired, muscular Gerudo going by Ganondorf playing an organ before you're fighting Ocarina of Time, or massive blue-skinned boar with a pitchfork in A Link to the Past when he's not disguised as a rogue wizard. Calamity Ganon here is more or less of a final form, one who probably got bored with trying to be another person or giving the appearance of another being in Hyrule, and now wants to use his powers to take control. And like past Zelda games, his true Dark Beast form is boar-like, even if it's a massive calamity entity floating around fields while you try to put him down on horseback. Sure, it's a problem he doesn't really have a character to him nor lines of dialogue, which we'll come back to, but the idea that he's an all-knowing malice makes him more or less godlike than previous games. Ganon has eyes watching over you, metaphorically and literally, with the glowing eyes watching you in the divine beast in Hyrule Castle. Going back to the storytelling aspect, non-linear storytelling in video gaming is nothing new. Going back a few years ago, games like Grand Theft Auto 3, Vice City, and San Andreas had a main storyline going for them, but all of the side missions and side quests allowed gamers to choose how they wanted to tell their GTA story. And even when the main story ends and the credits roll, you still have the option to roam around Liberty City, Vice City, or San Andreas respectively. Zelda games have more or less been used to the traditional linear storytelling. A Link to the Past is strictly linear, and the game ends the minute you beat Ganon and restore the Triforce. But Breath of the Wild is non-linear storytelling in an open world in its truest form. I mean, just think about that opening Wind Waker quote from the beginning of this chapter. Breath of the Wild is but one of the legends, and with each legend and their variations and differences from each other, there's always a hero who is waking up from a long sleep. How he got there and how long he's been there, however, varies from game to game. And he and the Master Sword he holds are always linked, no pun intended, to these stories. There's a Triforce which cannot fall into the hands of an evil guy, there's always a princess who needs to be saved, there's always an old king, there's always Hyrule in all of its natural forms. Whatever variation of this story you're telling, same story, but you are truly the Link now. You are the author of the pen. You are literally the text. If you watched my previous video essay on Night in the Woods, I mentioned that Night in the Woods was my go-to game for when autumn arrives and how the town of Possum Springs and its fall setting was appropriate for its story. What with the leaves falling down, school and football season in session, and Halloween right around the corner. And in the same vein, I call Breath of the Wild my go-to game for when spring arrives, at least until I revisit another Zelda game or when Tears of the Kingdom comes. Of course, the obvious difference between Night in the Woods and Breath of the Wild is that, apart from genres, referring to the last chapter of this essay, the former story is both personal and political, whereas Breath of the Wild's story is a non-linear action-adventure game. And because of the game's non-linear storytelling, every gamer playing it can go about however they want to complete it. However, as with any open-world game, whether you're picking a Grand Theft Auto game out of a hat, trying to recreate venturing out around the entirety of Middle-earth in a virtual Tolkien world, or even in games dealing with potentially billions of worlds like No Man's Sky, there's always a limit to how far anyone can go. Not just how far the game production and design team can go about creating an open world environment, but how much time an individual gamer is willing to invest in taking in that open world until it's time to put the controller down. Thusly, I find it convenient that any Zelda title, especially something as memorable and replayable as Breath of the Wild, would be my last game played before going off the gamer grid for a while. So, going on a tangent for a little bit, for me, I take a 2 to 3 month break between late June and mid-September so I can enjoy the summertime in between doing important real-life activities, as well as taking in the outdoors, never bothering to log into my Steam account or touch my Switch controller. Again, it just feels appropriate and timely and right that the last game I played before I set off for the summer months is one where everything in its environment is worth walking around or riding a horse through town to town for hours. Of course, most of the exploration in this game, from the fact that you have to find some shrines in order to teleport around for convenience, or maybe Korok seeds so you can improve your inventory a little, but even without shortcutting around Hyrule, I find having to see each area, climb high mountains, hunt around with a bow and arrow, and interacting with some of the NPCs worth it. Whether it's out of morbid curiosity and or out of respect for the production team putting so much time creating this version of Hyrule, I find that restarting BOTW each spring allows me to find something refreshing that I didn't know. Kind of like hiking out in the park you've been before here and there and finding something in nature you didn't realize was there before. So, full disclosure, again, without divulging too much into my personal life, I'm a big fan of going on long nature hikes if I'm not on the beach, especially during the months between the spring and autumn. And while I may not have my own Master Cycle Zero, get it at this point, Master Cycle sounds like motorcycle. I cycle around the shore with my bicycle for exercise and for the hell of it. However, more so in real life than the game we're talking about here. The weather can be a bummer sometimes, so it's a little hard to go outside in the mid-Atlantic area of the US when it rains and or thunders. Never mind that for a lot of us, real life work gets in the way. So when the winter season comes, the temperature goes down and the days get darker. We don't always know what the weather's gonna be like as climate change makes winters warmer and there's less snow, so video games are a nice little retreat before daylight savings time comes and the days start to get a little longer. But of course, there's always that urge to head out even when it's freezing, and it's tough finding a game that could replicate the experience of hiking for a bit. With any Zelda title, you know you're gonna have to deal with enemies and save Hyrule, the people in Zelda, but the open world of Hyrule allows you to hike, hunt, warp, and cook whatever and however you want. Most of it done outside and constantly traveling, always on the move. Of course, while you do so, you'll need rest, and sitting by the campfire might shortcut your nights, but you're better off either sleeping on a soft bed at one of the many stables in Hyrule or one of the unique Eddie Rupee beds in Retold Village, Source, Domain, Gerudo, or Gorgon City, to name a few places. They're more expensive than the $20 regular beds, but not by much since the game is pretty generous when it comes to exchanging items for rupees at any one of the shops, whether it's minerals or meals. Speaking of which, Breath of the Wild also emphasizes that getting rest is not the only way to gain health. For several hours on end, I experimented and researched specific meals for the proper time and day for Link to consume when it was needed. Sure, it's not a problem to eat an apple or two to gain a lost heart after a battle, but as you advance towards completing the game, you'll want to learn how to cook the many various meals and which ingredients each recipe needs for a meal or elixir. And you'll also want to have enough bows and arrows on hand for not only combat, for when you're venturing out in fields and you come across a bird about to make flight, a fleeing fox, or maybe a wolf or bear who's ready to attack you. I don't hunt in real life for ethical reasons, but certain meats and fishes are required for meals that can help your attack, defense, speed, and stamina, along with giving you some hearts and some yellow bonus hearts. These meals are essential if you're going to take on any of the forms of Ganon or fighting off a Lionel, and this means, along with whatever gear you have on, you'll have to strategize how you go about defeating each enemy, or how you'll be able to withstand the cold mountains of Heber or the volcanic Death Mountain without heavy metal gear. But again, all of the enemy combat and interactions essentially require you to explore more, not just to stick around in one location for too long, and that means having to walk around and see if you missed anything. In other words, blink and you might miss. To use an example of a small little indie game, which also emphasizes exploration, a short hike is a pretty fantastic little experience in which you play the bird character Claire, who spends her weekend jogging, climbing, swimming, and gliding around a fictional state park until she gets to the peak. Then the game's quote-unquote over and she can pretty much do whatever. The stakes in this game's universe are smaller and not once is her life in danger, but the whole point of the game, putting aside the fantastic retro graphics and relaxing soundtrack, is the open world. Subconsciously, in my opinion, games like A Short Hike and Breath of the Wild emphasize why we can't take nature for granted. Even in a world where climate change threatens our environment while we don't take serious legislative action, even in a world as cold and cruel as Earth, those small moments walking in a deep forest in the spring, summer, and autumn should be remembered more than doing another boss fight in a virtual world. That's not a diss against the authorial intention of the aforementioned nature games. It's just that it's a compliment that these games try to capture something real, something that we yearn for, a world that which we should try to explore for ourselves and become the link between our small, brief lives and the whole world. Okay, so I would be lying if I said that Breath of the Wild was 100% perfect, even with all of the world building and glorious details. Most of them are minor nitpicks that don't affect the overall gaming experience. Like, I am willing to look past the fact that frogs, which are trying to hop away from you, can just magically disappear and vanish into rocks or something. See also the bears. That glitch is ignorable, and unless you are playing Master Mode, most of the villains in Hyrule are easy to deal with. Even the various Hinox and Lynels seem to become a breeze if you have the right strategy. The shrines are useful for getting around Hyrule, but they too have a problem. It's not so much the difficulty of the shrines, which is the problem, though I'll admit, I thought I was going to have a stroke several times trying to move my controller and managing to twist my wrist around while trying to get a ball to unlock a door here and there. If there's anything positive to say about this annoyance, the shrine challenges in Breath of the Wild, even the extra ones in the expansion DLC, take full advantage of the Switch's hardware and software abilities, especially if you need to tilt your controller here and there. No, the problem with the shrines is the lack of variety in the inside. Teleport yourself to one of the shrines, walk right in, and it's always the same background wallpaper and floor, and the same blue glass protecting the monks, so why not have some of the shrine's interior correspond with each respective area's environment, like say snow creeping into some of the Hebra shrines, water leaking through the roof near Zora, or sand on the floor in Gerudo. As far as the side quests are concerned, while some of them can get tedious, I don't mind checking them off the list, as the trade-off with doing them is more exploration around areas I haven't been around, and a few items I could use, like a diamond to sell or meals. Yet completing the 90 side quests in Hyrule, along with doing the main and shrine quests, don't count towards your percentage to get to 100%, but getting all 900 Korok seeds amounts to 72% of total completion, and all you have to show for it is this smelly thing. Well, I can't smell it, but the feeling of having to go through all of that even after your inventory slots are full and can't increase anymore is awful. Like, I can smell that pile of bullshit from my couch. Zelda, the reoccurring princess character, is still a damsel despite Breath of the Wild setting her up as being the most powerful character in the game, and the one who ultimately puts Ganon in his place after you've done your duty with the Bow of Light. Well, at least until we find out more from Tears of the Kingdom this May. Through the flashback clips found while exploring Hyrule, we get teased that Zelda is going to be some kind of warrior princess. I mean, just look at her champion's attire in this clip and then compare that to the final cutscene, fighting Dark Beast Ganon as she defeats him with a white heavenly dress. Not only that, but the Explorer's Guide assures the audience that, quote, at its heart is the wise Princess Zelda. But don't be fooled, she's so much more than just a princess. Goddess, warrior, sage, pirate, ghost, this lady sure knows how to make an impact. She is the light that shines upon the land of Hyrule and the embodiment of wisdom. Together with Link, the courageous hero, it is her eternal duty to help the chosen hero keep the corrupting power of evil at bay, and to protect the sacred Triforce from falling into the wrong hands. And yet, in order for Zelda to utilize her powers against Ganon, a man, i.e. a young, good-looking, baby-faced man named Link, still needs to save her. I mean, it's not as overtly sexist as having to go through another castle to save the Princess Peach in Super Mario Bros., but comparing Zelda here to her alter ego Tetra in Wind Waker, or even a game like Ocarina of Time, where she's actively helping Link under the sheep disguise before getting captured by Ganondorf, just shows that, once again, for a series which carries the name of the princess in its title, it's disappointing that the titular character is relegated to the background apart from the lines of dialogue spoken in Link's head. And no, I don't buy the excuse from the game's producer, E.G. Aonuma, that, to paraphrase, if they had Princess Zelda as the main character who fights, then what would Link do? And then going on to confirm that Link is the protagonist, not Zelda. It more or less diminishes the significance of the game trying to make Link more gender neutral, as I discussed in a previous chapter. Also, and this is just another nagging nitpick, the will they won't they kiss scene at the end always felt like a blow to Zelda's agency as a fully fleshed out character who needs a man in her life. Ganon, the main antagonist in the Zelda series, can be a fun, interesting villain in his previous incarnations compared to his Mario counterpart Bowser, but here he isn't even a character with thoughts, quotations, and feelings, not even in that Sauron Lord of the Rings sense where he's present with his forces, and in the main character's thoughts. Again, as discussed previously, the intention here is to make Ganon's evil more abstract, yet still omnipresent in his calamity form, but that takes away the interest out of the character when you consider his previous game history. Like, I don't care if he's able to take on 4 forms, I want to know what his motivations and desires are apart from what's explained in cutscenes with the king and Mipha. The 4 forms he takes on, along with the calamity and dark beast forms of Ganon, can be worth the combat just to get some of the powers from the 4 deceased characters, but of course you could just shortcut the entire game and walk right up to the calamity infested Hyrule, even with only 3 hearts half naked and all, and challenge Ganon right then and there and call it a successful speedrun. And while I have nothing against speedrunners, for me I always like to explore how game designers invented and invested so much time in a non-fictional virtual space, which is probably the reason why replays of BioShock, System Shock 2, Vice City, and other games always take up way more time than I think they are. Also, and while this isn't really a problem for most gamers, but it bothers me from a voice acting perspective, I sigh in disbelief every time I think about this point, the accents of Zelda and the king.
It devastated everything in its path, lo, a century ago.
But maybe up there.
That princess was my own daughter, my dear Zelda.
It's all my fault.
Selected 4 skilled individuals.
Divine beasts. The Guardians. They've all turned against us.
Forgive me.
Like, okay, I don't expect video game accents to be 100% authentically British. I mean, Hyrule isn't exactly a stand-in for Great Britain. And I know I don't have the greatest voice, but why didn't they just bother hiring British actors if they're going to do dialogue with accents? It just makes hearing the accents unintentionally funnier than they should be, especially when the king pronounces words like past as past. Then again, nothing in Breath of the Wild will be as funny as this. Breath of the Wild is one of the most beautifully detailed games Nintendo has ever put out, along with being a fantastic retelling of a classic story in video games, and based on my experience, it's arguably the best Zelda game I've ever played and holds up incredibly well, over half a decade after its release. It may not be the ideal Zelda game for beginners to start off with if you're just getting into the series. That game is probably still a link to the past since it's telling a simpler, streamlined Zelda story with basic SNES mechanics, but as a game for people just getting into Nintendo Switch for the first time, and for those looking for a game to put at number 1 on their top 100 Switch games, Breath of the Wild is still the first game to go with. And if you were stranded on an island with only you and your Switch, and you only had one game, you can't go wrong having Breath of the Wild since no other Switch game has managed to topple its experience yet. Sure, other viewers may disagree with the main thesis of this video, or any other opinion expressed here. After all, some gamers' experience and upbringing may be different from mine, and I can respect that. That's the nature of video game discussion, as they are not just an entertainment medium for consumption, but as an art form, and I realize I may have overpersonalized in several parts of this essay, and I'm sorry about that. But as I was completing the script for this video, one valuable lesson I learned not too long ago is that a great piece of art or media can say something about you that you didn't know until now. A painting like Picasso's The Old Guitars can evoke feelings of melancholy. John Coltrane's A Love Supreme is a poetic religious prayer conveyed by saxophone, and Breath of the Wild is the closest thing for gamers to feel alive in the present moment and remind them that the world is much larger than the 4 corners of our bedroom. It reminds us that, despite our short lifespans, life should feel much bigger, and we should never take for granted the small time we have and take advantage of what's out there. Through happiness, laughs, or tears, we're witnesses to our life's greatest gift. Even in an unforgiving, cold world like ours, when times seem to be getting rougher, there's always something to do, in calmness or out in the wild. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video essay, please comment and like. If you want to see more video essays, please consider subscribing to the Armchair Brain YouTube channel and ring the bell as well to watch discussions on topics in philosophy, art, politics, and video games. Also, please subscribe to my Twitch streaming channel at twitch.tv/armchairbrain to watch me play video games and occasionally discuss other topics for future video essays.